It was in a Paris street beneath a dim gaslight that Nancy Cunard was seen, draped in bangles that clattered like muted bells, her dark eyes unyielding, her lips painted in defiance. To many she was a scandal, to others a prophecy of rebellion. She did not walk quietly. She moved as though the world itself were a stage for disobedience, her body a vessel for protest, her spirit restless and radiant. Such was the image etched in memory: the heiress who refused her inheritance, the poet who wrote against silence, the lover who defied the boundaries of race and class, the woman whose very life became a challenge to all that was expected of her. Welcome, wanderer of memory. Tell me, in the quiet of the comments, when and where you listen, so that our voices may weave together across oceans and years. If you wish, subscribe, so that you may always return to these circles of story and remembrance. Nancy Cunard's story does not begin in the streets of Paris, nor in the crowded cafes of Montparnasse, but in the polished halls of English wealth. To understand her rebellion, one must first know the prison from which she escaped. Hers was not the prison of iron or of stone, but of privilege and expectation. The Cunards were ship owners, rulers of an empire of steel hulls and ocean liners, conveyors of power across the seas. Yet within the grand homes and gardens of that dynasty, a child named Nancy would begin to feel the suffocating embrace of wealth, the narrow corridors of society's gaze, the stifling scent of roses in vases too perfectly arranged. It is here that her life begins, in the tension between gilded walls and the desire for flight, between inheritance and refusal. And so we step quietly into her childhood, where rebellion had not yet been named, but where its seeds were already sown in silence. The Cunard fortune was vast, and in its shadow Nancy Cunard first opened her eyes. Born in 1896, she was the daughter of Sir Botch Cunard, heir to the great shipping line, and Lady Emerald Cunard, a woman whose very name seemed to shine with the luster of gemstones and whose ambition was as glittering as the chandeliers that lit their halls. Their home was a palace of wealth, filled with servants moving like whispers, with polished floors reflecting the glow of oil lamps, with staircases winding into private chambers where every movement was observed and measured. For some, this would have been paradise, a cradle of power and prestige. But for Nancy, even as a small child, it felt more like a theater where her role had already been written, and where every gesture must conform to a script she had not chosen. She was restless. She would wander the rooms, trailing her hands along tapestries and carved wooden banisters, as if trying to find a way to feel the world beyond. The scent of cut flowers replaced daily filled the air with sweetness that to her seemed sickly, almost oppressive. Outside, the garden stretched in manicured perfection, each hedge trimmed, each path arranged, each fountain gurgling in quiet obedience. The silence of privilege weighed upon her, for there was no need to shout, no urgency to survive. Yet children sense when life is too neat, too ordered, too still. Within her there stirred a longing for something else, something less controlled, less embalmed in ritual. Her mother, Lady Emerald, was a force in society. Known for her brilliant parties, her connections to artists and musicians, she cultivated glamour and influence with an almost ruthless energy. Nancy observed her mother's brilliance, admired it perhaps, but also felt the coldness of her ambition. Lady Emerald's heart seemed always turned outward, towards society, rather than inward toward her child. Sir Botch, her father, remained more remote, preferring the solace of his estates and his hunts. Nancy, left often in the company of governesses, found herself adrift in a world of expectations without tenderness. And yet, she was not without imagination. Books filled her rooms, and in them she found voices that whispered of other lives. She read poetry. She scribbled words in notebooks. She began to sense that language might be a key to the freedom she hungered for. In the stillness of her youth, while others saw a well-dressed girl of fortune, Nancy was already becoming a listener to hidden voices, a collector of phrases and images that hinted at rebellion. The act of writing, small though it was, gave her a secret power, a way of shaping the world beyond what was arranged for her. But the world around her continued its performance. Dinner parties with their clinking glasses and orchestrated conversations, visits from dignitaries and aristocrats, their voices smooth with wealth. The long processions to church, where piety was displayed as carefully as jewels. For Nancy, each ritual seemed both beautiful and hollow, a mirror reflecting expectations she could never embrace. Was it here, one wonders, that her rejection of wealth began? Did she, even then, look around the dining hall with its silver cutlery and candlelight and feel that something essential was missing, something real and unscripted? We cannot know for certain. Yet the memory of her early restlessness clings to the story, like the faint scent of smoke before fire. There are tales of her as a girl, slipping away from her governess, hiding in corners with a book, or venturing into the stables to speak with grooms and workers. The contrast between the velvet rooms of the house and the earthy smells of hay and horses must have offered her a glimpse of another rhythm of life. She was drawn to those who were not trapped by the etiquette of salons, whose speech was unpolished, whose gestures were unguarded. Perhaps she sought authenticity, though she would not have known the word then. Music filled her early years as well. Lady Emerald adored the arts, and their house often echoed with the sounds of pianos, violins, and voices lifted in song. Nancy listened intently. For her, music was more than decoration. It seemed to offer a doorway into emotion, into something raw and uncontainable. She would sit at the edges of these performances, her eyes wide, her small hands clasped, as though she were listening for something only she could hear. It was in these contrasts, the silence of wealth and the noise of music, the order of the garden and the wildness of her imagination, that Nancy's earliest sense of self was formed. She was both inside and outside, both heiress and observer. As she grew, she would come to resist more openly, to reject the privileges pressed upon her. But even as a child, rebellion had already begun as a quiet stirring. Like the first movement of a symphony, barely audible, yet undeniable. In later years, when she was seen in Paris draped in bangles and radical poetry, those who judged her scandalous could not see the little girl wandering the halls of her childhood home, already searching for escape. They could not hear the faint sound of her pencil scratching in a notebook, or the distant echo of her footsteps down a garden path, or the quiet sigh as she lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what freedom might feel like. And so, her childhood remains like a portrait, a gilded frame enclosing a restless spirit, the beginning of a story that would unfold in defiance. We leave her here, in the opulent halls of Cunard fortune, listening to the sound of a piano drifting faintly through corridors, its notes rising and falling like promises not yet fulfilled. The piano notes linger in the corridor, as though each one were suspended in the air, soft echoes brushing against the walls of Nancy's youth. Music in those days was more than background. It was the invisible thread binding the lives of the Cunards to the wider world of art and society. Her mother, Lady Emerald, hosted soirees where the great musicians of Europe played, where voices trained for opera filled the air with sound so perfect it seemed to carry heaven itself into their drawing rooms. To many, such evenings were the pinnacle of culture. But for Nancy, the sound was not simply beautiful, it was also troubling, for she felt in it the vast gulf between performance and reality. She would sit listening, not always at the center of the gathering, but on the edge, eyes sharp, absorbing not only the sound of the music, but the restless movements of those who performed it, their fingers trembling on strings, their brows damp beneath the weight of expectation. She began to realize that behind every polished note there was strain, effort, and sometimes even pain. It was this awareness that truth hides beneath the masks of beauty that would mark her for life. In the solitude that followed those performances, Nancy returned again and again to the written word. She began to craft her own verses in the margins of her schoolbooks, shy attempts at expression, but tinged with an intensity that betrayed how much she felt trapped within her world. These first poems were fragments, little bursts of imagery, the changing light on a garden path, the smell of rain on stone, the curve of a hand across piano keys. They may have seemed simple, even naive, but they were also her first attempts to claim a voice in a world that preferred her silent, ornamental, and obedient. Poetry became her confidant. Within the hushed walls of Cunard wealth, her lines carried whispers of escape. Her education, as was fitting for a daughter of her station, was carefully managed. Governesses and tutors instructed her in languages, manners, and the history of civilizations. But what she treasured most were the books she discovered on her own. Volumes smuggled into her reading time like contraband. She read Byron, Shelley, the Brontes. She traced each word as though it contained a promise. To write, to live passionately, to challenge the world, these ideas began to take root in her heart, though they clashed with the world her mother laid out for her. Lady Emerald envisioned for Nancy a brilliant marriage, a union of wealth and power. Nancy envisioned something else, though it had not yet taken shape, only a restless sense that her destiny lay outside the corridors of power. Yet she was still a girl, and like all girls of her age, she sought connection. Friends were invited to the Cunard home, other daughters of privilege who admired Nancy's bold remarks and her refusal to bow too deeply to custom. They were fascinated by her quick tongue and sharp wit, though some whispered she was too brash, too independent. Nancy accepted their admiration, but secretly doubted its value. She felt herself different, restless in ways her companions could not fully understand. For while they dreamed of balls, gowns, and suitors, Nancy dreamed of words, of smoke-filled rooms where art and politics clashed, of nights where laughter and sorrow mingled until dawn. Her relationship with her mother grew strained as she moved into adolescence. Lady Emerald, with her unyielding social ambitions, did not easily tolerate disobedience. Nancy, in turn, began to bristle at the control, at the endless talk of appearances, at the careful orchestration of every moment. Small rebellions began. A book hidden in her skirts, a remark made too sharply at dinner, a refusal to wear a dress chosen for her. They were minor gestures, but to Nancy they felt like declarations of self. Each act of defiance gave her a taste of freedom, however fleeting, and each one strengthened her conviction that she would not live by the rules of others. And yet, in quieter hours, doubt crept in. Could she ever truly escape the destiny laid out for her? Could she, born into the Cunard fortune, ever walk into the world as her own creation? She would lie awake in her bed, listening to the faint sound of the piano from downstairs, wondering if her words could ever matter. She felt both the weight of inheritance and the fire of rebellion. These contradictions shaped her, as contradictions always do, sharpening her sense of the world's hypocrisy, while also deepening her yearning to live authentically. When she began to write in earnest, her verses revealed a rawness that startled those who read them. They were not polished, nor were they meant to be. They were urgent, searching, restless. Friends who saw them praised her talent, but some dismissed them as the indulgences of a wealthy girl. Nancy, however, knew that her writing was not a pastime. It was survival, the only way to breathe in a world of suffocation. Poetry became not only a craft, but a lifeline, a thread leading her out of the gilded cage. Her early work drew from the rhythms of the music she had heard in her home, but it also carried the influence of the novels she devoured. She began to understand that language could be both weapon and refuge. To write was to resist the silence imposed upon her. To write was to carve out a self separate from Lady Emerald, separate from Cunard ships, separate even from the expectations of marriage and motherhood. She had discovered in secret a way to begin her rebellion. But for now, she remained in her childhood world, a restless girl scribbling verses while governesses hovered and society prepared to mold her into something else. The world did not yet know her, not as the radical poet of later years, not as the lover of jazz musicians or the champion of anti-fascism. She was still a shadow forming, a voice still gathering strength. And yet, even then, the seeds of scandal were sown. For scandal does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with small refusals, with words written in margins, with gazes that look beyond what is offered. As she grew, those refusals would multiply. Soon she would leave behind the quiet halls of her childhood and enter the roaring world of London's avant-garde, where her voice would clash against tradition and her identity would be remade in the fires of art and rebellion. But here, at the threshold, we linger with her still, a young girl in a house of wealth, holding a pen in her hand while the sound of piano notes drift through the corridor, drying into silence like ink upon paper. The ink dries upon the paper, the lines still fresh though already fading into the quiet of her room, and from that silence there emerges another sound, the rising chatter of London cafes where smoke drifts upward in restless spirals. It is here, beyond the corridors of her childhood, that Nancy Cunard first discovers the world of the avant-garde, a world as sharp and unpredictable as her own restless heart. London, in those years after the Great War, was a city haunted and alive at once. The scars of conflict clung to its streets, yet the air vibrated with experiment, with the hunger for something new, something unshackled from the weight of tradition. Into this world Nancy stepped, not yet certain of herself, yet determined to resist being bound by the silks and expectations that had followed her since birth. She was still young, barely out of her girlhood, when she began to wander into the cafes and salons where writers and painters gathered. These were not the polite drawing rooms of her mother's society, filled with rehearsed laughter and curated conversations. These were smoky rooms where the smell of tobacco mingled with the scent of spilled ale, where voices rose in arguments over art and politics, where every table seemed to throb with a mixture of fatigue and hope. Nancy entered them like one steps into a storm, unafraid of being disheveled, unafraid of being noticed. She was tall, slender, with sharp features and eyes that carried both defiance and sorrow. Men looked at her, women too, for she carried herself differently, not as an heiress, but as a seeker. Her fashion already marked her apart. While society expected her to dress in silks and pearls, Nancy began to experiment with bold cuts, loose lines, trousers worn with a nonchalance that shocked her peers. She cut her hair short, wore bangles on her arms that clattered as she moved, turned her body into a declaration. Clothes were no longer garments, but weapons, a way of slicing through expectation. Each time she entered a room, she made it known she would not be tamed by convention. The writers she met were fascinated. They were men who had seen war, who had written verses in trenches and drawn sketches in hospitals. Their voices trembled with both brilliance and despair. Nancy, listening, felt their words strike something deep within her. Here, at last, were people who refused the polished performances of her childhood world. They spoke with urgency. They contradicted one another. They lived as though each night might be their last. She joined their conversations, not timidly, but with the sharpness of someone long preparing for such company. Her wit was quick, her laughter edged, her remarks daring. Some dismissed her as a socialite seeking thrills, but others sensed the sincerity beneath her defiance. Ezra Pound was among those who noticed her. His intensity, his obsession with reshaping poetry, drew Nancy into a circle of modernists whose works shattered the rhythms of the past. Through him, she encountered Wyndham Lewis, whose sharp lines in both art and prose mirrored the jagged restlessness she felt inside herself. Later, Aldous Huxley, too, would drift into her orbit, their connection both intellectual and personal, a weaving of minds as much as bodies. Nancy was drawn to these men not because she wished to be their muse, but because she yearned to be their equal. Yet the world was slow to grant her that place. Still, she persisted. She wrote and published her first small collection of poems, tentative but unmistakable in their voice. Critics, largely men, often dismissed her lines as unrefined, the work of an amateur dabbling in art. But Nancy knew better. Her poetry was not meant to be polished jewels, cut and gleaming for display. It was meant to be raw, like the smoke in the cafes, like the ache in the streets of post-war London. She did not wish to soothe, she wished to provoke. There were nights when she would sit with these writers, her bangles clinking as she gestured, her voice rising in debate. Outside, the fog of London pressed against the windows, muffling the noise of carriages and footsteps. Inside, arguments raged about what literature should become, about the future of civilization itself. Nancy, though young, spoke with the conviction of one who had already rejected an entire inheritance. What use was money, she would ask, if it chained the spirit? What use was tradition, if it silenced the truth? The men around her listened, some with admiration, others with unease. For Nancy was not content to be a silent figure at the edge of their brilliance. She demanded to be part of it. And yet, even in this world, she felt the shadow of expectation. To many, she remained the wealthy heiress who played at rebellion, the daughter of Lady Emerald whose fortune had paved her entry into these circles. She could not entirely escape her name, nor the whispers it carried. But rather than deny it, she chose to transform it, turning the weight of Cunard into a platform from which to leap higher. If society expected her to be respectable, she would be scandalous. If they expected her to be passive, she would be loud. If they expected her to be loyal to class and race, she would cross those boundaries without hesitation. The more time she spent in these avant-garde gatherings, the more her sense of identity solidified. She was no longer simply a restless girl scribbling in secret. She was a woman forging a life of her own, even if that life would be marked by conflict and misunderstanding. Her friendships grew intense, her loves tumultuous, her writing urgent. The city around her seemed to echo her own inner state, dark, vibrant, scarred, alive. What is it that draws a person to rebellion? Is it the absence of love in childhood, the excess of privilege, or a temperament born of fire? In Nancy's case, perhaps it was all three. She'd been denied tenderness, drowned in wealth, and yet gifted with a spirit too restless to submit. In the cafes of London, she found the first true taste of belonging, though it was belonging of a dangerous kind, filled with instability, betrayal, and disappointment. Still, she embraced it, for it was real, and reality, however painful, was better than the suffocating perfection of her mother's drawing rooms. The laughter of those nights lingers in memory, though it often ended in weariness and quarrels and empty glasses left on tables, sticky with spilt drinks. Nancy would walk home through fog-shrouded streets, her bangles clinking faintly in the silence, her thoughts swirling with half-formed verses. The city loomed around her, indifferent and immense, yet she felt herself alive within it, alive in a way she had never been within the manicured gardens of her childhood. She belonged, not because she was accepted, but because she refused to vanish. And so, the ink that dried on her childhood pages now expanded into printed words, fragile though they were. Nancy Cunard had begun her journey into the world of art and rebellion, and though society still watched her with suspicion, she walked forward without apology. The smoke of London cafes wrapped around her, a cloak of both danger and promise. The laughter faded into silence, leaving behind only the echo of voices that would follow her for years. As the night ends, the smoke dissolves, and with it comes the faint sound of laughter trailing off into nothing, like a flame extinguished in the dark. Yet within that silence lies the doorway to Paris, where the laughter would return in new forms, where Nancy would become not only a participant, but a muse, a figure both adored and overlooked. And there, beneath the lights of Montparnasse, her story would deepen. The laughter fades into smoke, curling upward until it dissolves into nothing. And in that silence, a new city rises before us, its streets alive with the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, its cafes spilling light into the dark. Paris. It was here, beneath the restless lamps of Montparnasse, that Nancy Cunard's presence transformed from that of a curious participant in London's avant-garde to a muse of artists and writers whose names would later burn brightly across the 20th century. She came to Paris with the air of one who had already severed ties with the polite expectations of English society, and yet her arrival was not triumphant but searching, as though she were seeking a mirror in which her own contradictions might be reflected. Montparnasse was a gathering place for wanderers, lovers of art, exiles, dreamers who believed that the old order had shattered with the war and that a new one might be invented amid paint-stained studios and cluttered cafes. The air smelled of tobacco and cheap wine, of oil paint drying on canvases, of bread still warm from street stalls. Into this world Nancy walked, tall and slender, with her sharp profile and bracelets clattering like faint bells. She drew attention not only for her beauty, but for her refusal to bow to convention. She smoked with the men, argued with the poets, drank until dawn with painters whose canvases leaned unfinished against the walls. Her presence fascinated and unsettled. Writers saw in her both elegance and danger, a woman who seemed carved from the world of privilege, yet who rejected its comfort with almost reckless disdain. Some called her fragile. Others saw in her an indomitable will. To many, she became a muse, a figure of inspiration upon whom they projected their desires, their frustrations, their visions of modern womanhood. Ezra Pound had already admired her sharp intelligence. Wyndham Lewis sketched her angular features with the same severity that marked his art. And Aldous Huxley found in her both intimacy and distance, writing characters that bore her shadow. Yet to be seen as muse was a paradox for Nancy. It granted her visibility, yet it risked effacing her own voice. For what does it mean to be remembered only as inspiration and not as creator? Nancy wrestled with this question even as she moved among these circles. To be a muse meant to be admired, desired, immortalized, but it also meant to be objectified, fixed in place, silent while others spoke. She longed not only to be looked at, but to be heard, to have her own words echo as powerfully as those of the men who surrounded her. And so she continued to write, her poems shaped not by the neat forms of polite society, but by the fractured rhythms of modern life, by the music of jazz, by the restless tempo of the city. Her relationships in Paris were stormy, marked by passion and conflict. Love affairs unfolded like poems themselves, filled with sudden sparks and bitter endings. She loved fiercely, with a devotion that frightened some of her companions. Yet in love, as in art, she could never be content with half measures. She demanded intensity, truth, and risk. Many men were drawn to her magnetism, but few could withstand the force of her expectations. And when they faltered, she turned away without hesitation, for she preferred solitude to compromise. Evenings in Montparnasse stretched into dawn, the cafes filled with painters arguing about form, poets declaiming their verses, musicians beating out rhythms on tables. Nancy was there, always at the center or the edge, her bangles flashing in the dim light, her laughter ringing out like a challenge. She spoke freely, her voice sharp, sometimes mocking, sometimes tender. Those who underestimated her soon discovered her capacity to cut through pretense with a single remark. Yet for all her fierceness, there was also a melancholy in her gaze, as though she carried within her a knowledge that rebellion always exacts a price. Was she happy in these moments? Perhaps happiness is too simple a word. She was alive, and that aliveness was its own form of triumph. For a woman born into a dynasty of ships and fortune, to sit in a cafe among penniless artists, to be intoxicated by words rather than wealth, was itself a declaration of freedom. Yet freedom was never complete. The shadow of her inheritance followed her, the whispers of scandal, the endless struggle to be taken seriously as an artist in her own right. The paradox persisted. She was admired as muse even as her own voice was dismissed. One can imagine her returning home after such nights, the streets quiet, the lamps flickering, her footsteps echoing. She carried with her both the exhilaration of having lived outside the lines and the weariness of being misunderstood. She would remove her bangles, set them on the table, and in the silence, write a few lines before sleep. Lines about light on stone, about the weight of gazes, about the hunger for authenticity. In those fragments, perhaps, was the truest Nancy, the one who longed not to be reflected in others' eyes, but to carve her own image into the world. In Paris, she became a figure of contradiction, heiress and exile, muse and creator, lover and loner. These contradictions were not failures, but the essence of her existence. For what is rebellion if not a refusal to be one thing only? She embodied this refusal with every gesture, every word, every affair, every poem. She scandalized high society not because she courted attention, but because she lived without apology. And in a world still bound by convention, that was the deepest scandal of all. As one evening drew to a close, glasses half empty on tables, arguments unresolved, Nancy placed her hand upon the rim of her own wine glass, her bracelets chiming faintly, and set it down unfinished. That sound, delicate and decisive, lingers. It is the sound of her refusing to drink what is offered, of leaving behind what does not satisfy, of stepping once more into the unknown where her own voice awaited. The sound of the glass being set down unfinished lingers in the air, delicate yet firm, and from that faint chime comes a deeper resolution. Nancy Cunard had been admired, desired, and painted into poems and portraits by others, but now she sought to be something more than the echo of another's imagination. To leave a glass unfinished is to refuse what does not satisfy, and in that refusal lies the seed of her next transformation. The Paris nights of laughter and debate had given her a taste of freedom, but they had also reminded her of the silence imposed on women who wished to speak as creators rather than serve as muses. And Nancy could not remain silent. She began to write with greater intensity, her verses sharper, jagged, filled with the pulse of discontent. She did not polish them into elegance, for life as she knew it was not elegant. Her poems carried the restlessness of cafes, the sharp corners of conversations, the unresolved ache of desire. When her first volumes appeared, critics reacted with disdain. They dismissed her work as uneven, too emotional, too careless in form. To them, she was an heiress playing at literature, dabbling in poetry between soirees. Their condescension did not surprise her, for she had long known that the world measured her not by her words, but by her fortune, her lovers, her lineage. Yet the dismissal struck a chord of anger within her. Why was it that a man's jagged verse could be celebrated as modern, while her own was labeled as incompetence? Why must her every gesture be read through the prism of her wealth or her body? These questions burned through her writing, turning her defiance into fuel. She was not deterred by rejection. If anything, she leaned more fiercely into her rebellion. Each poem became a declaration that she would not be silenced, even if the world refused to hear her. The very rawness of her lines was her answer to those who demanded refinement. She wished to capture the world as it truly felt, disjointed, restless, fractured by war, and haunted by disillusionment. Life was not polished, so why should her poetry be? Her friends and lovers saw the change in her. She no longer simply accompanied conversations, but led them, her voice cutting through smoke and laughter with clarity. Those who had once viewed her as a muse now found themselves confronted by her demands to be recognized as equal. Some admired this transformation, others recoiled. For there is comfort in a muse who reflects a man's vision, but discomfort in a woman who insists upon her own. Nancy was willing to risk that discomfort. Better to be feared or mocked than to be invisible. Her style, both in words and in dress, grew bolder. The bracelets multiplied on her arms, clinking like a chorus whenever she moved. Her short hair framed her face with severity. Her clothes flowed loose and unorthodox, more sculpted by defiance than by fashion. She walked through Paris like a living poem, each choice of garment another stanza of rebellion. The city watched her, whispered of her scandal, yet could not look away. And still she wrote. Late into the night, after the noise of cafes had faded, she returned to her desk, the candlelight trembling as her pen scratched across the page. The lines were not always cohesive, but they pulsed with truth. She wrote of alienation, of love that burned too quickly, of the emptiness of wealth, of the search for freedom in a world unwilling to grant it. These were not poems meant to please, they were poems meant to resist. Each word a refusal, each stanza a gesture of survival. It is tempting, looking back, to measure her by the reception of her work, to weigh her success in terms of critical praise or lasting recognition. But that is to miss the essence of Nancy's creation. For her, poetry was not a career, but a necessity, as essential as breath. She was not crafting monuments for posterity, but fragments of her own existence, evidence that she had lived against the tide. Whether praised or scorned, her words remained hers alone. In these years, Nancy also began to understand more clearly that her rebellion was not only personal, but political. To defy convention as a woman in her time was already a form of politics, but she sensed something broader. She recognized the hierarchies of race, of class, of empire, and began to question them with the same intensity that she questioned gender roles. The personal and the political intertwined in her writing, foreshadowing the more overt activism that would later define her. Yet such awareness came at a cost. The more she pushed against society, the more isolated she became from her origins. Her mother could not understand her choices, could not forgive her public scandals, could not reconcile the heiress she had raised with the radical Nancy was becoming. Friends from her childhood drifted away, unwilling to follow her into the smoky depths of Montparnasse. Even some within the artistic circles hesitated, unsure whether to embrace her as equal or dismiss her as eccentric. Nancy stood at the threshold of belonging and exclusion, never entirely secure in either, but perhaps she preferred it so. To belong fully would have meant to surrender, to compromise, to accept the categories society offered, and Nancy could not accept categories. She existed in between, and in that in-betweenness lay her freedom. If the critics would not recognize her poetry, she would still write. If society would not embrace her choices, she would still live them. If friends and family abandoned her, she would walk forward alone. For her, rebellion was not an option, but a necessity. The candle on her desk sputters, its flame bending as though exhausted, but it does not go out. It trembles, it gutters, it wavers. In that wavering light, Nancy continues to write, her pen carving lines into paper as though carving her own existence against the shadows pressing in. The critics may scoff, the world may turn away, but still she writes, still she breathes, still she refuses. The candle trembles one last time, its light fragile, flickering against the darkness, and then steadies itself into silence. That small, flickering flame leads us onward into the fire of romance, where Nancy's words and her heart would burn with a force that neither poetry nor society could contain. The candle gutters, trembling in the breath of the night, and from that fragile flame there arises another fire, not of wax and wick, but of flesh and longing. For Nancy Cunard, words were a form of survival. But love, when it came, was a tempest. She did not fall lightly, nor did she linger in half-shadows. Her affairs burned brightly, consuming her nights, filling her days with urgency, leaving ashes in their wake. If her poetry was jagged, her romances were storms, their beginnings charged with the thrill of possibility, and their endings marked by the silence of wreckage. In Paris, where cafes never truly slept, she found herself drawn into a succession of loves that shaped and shattered her in equal measure. André Breton, Louis Aragon, and other poets of surrealist fire crossed her path, men whose words unmoored reality, whose manifestos tore at convention. With them, Nancy tasted a love that was both intellectual and physical, conversations that blurred into embraces, manifestos written in the same ink as letters of desire. She was fascinated by their fervor, their certainty that art could transform existence. Yet she was also troubled by the ease with which they made muses of women, offering adoration but rarely equality. She wanted more than to be reflected in their poems. She wanted to be the one writing them. Her affair with Aragon was particularly turbulent, their conversations filled with sparks, their intimacy carrying the edge of combat. He was brilliant, devoted to the surrealist vision of liberation through imagination, yet he carried within him the restlessness of one who sought endless novelty. Nancy, already intense, demanded constancy even within passion, a devotion as total as her own. They quarreled as fiercely as they loved, voices rising in cafes until strangers turned to listen, their arguments spilling into the streets, echoing against the stones. Yet when reconciliation came, it was as fierce as the quarrel, embraces that erased words for a time. Their love was not gentle but storm-driven, like two ships colliding in dark seas, breaking apart only to be drawn together again by unseen tides. It was not only poets, musicians, painters, wanderers of many kinds passed through her life. Nancy's hunger for intimacy was not bound by class or reputation. She sought in others what she sought in herself, a refusal to conform, a willingness to live unguardedly. Many could not withstand the force of her expectations, but for brief nights or months they shared with her the intoxication of rebellion. She was notorious in society for these loves, whispered about in salons, condemned in newspapers as reckless and immoral. Yet Nancy did not care for condemnation. She cared for truth, and truth in love was never tidy. There were quieter romances, too, nights when affection softened the sharpness of her days. But even these carried the undercurrent of unease, for Nancy could never fully trust that others loved her for herself rather than for her beauty, her fortune, her scandalous aura. She longed to be known beyond these surfaces, to be cherished not as an idea, but as a woman of flesh and mind. The rarity of such intimacy only deepened her loneliness. In these years, her writing absorbed the turbulence of her loves, Poems written in the early mornings after sleepless nights carried fragments of arguments, glimpses of tenderness, the ache of departures. Love became both subject and metaphor, a mirror of her larger rebellion against the constraints of society. Just as she refused to accept silence in literature, so she refused to accept compromise in love. Each affair was another act of resistance, another attempt to live authentically even at the risk of ruin. But storms exhaust as much as they enliven. There were mornings when Nancy awoke with the taste of bitterness on her lips, the rooms filled with smoke from the night before, her bracelets scattered on the floor like remnants of battle. Passion had its cost, and the cost was often solitude, her lovers drifting away, her heart left to wrestle with its own demands. She carried on, yet the weight grew heavier, her eyes darker, her laughter edged with sorrow. Rain often seemed to accompany her in those years. Paris rain, sudden and insistent, drumming on windows, soaking cobblestones, blurring the light of street lamps. It mirrored her inner state, washing over the city as her emotions washed over her. She would walk beneath it without umbrella, her bangles wet and glinting, her hair plastered to her face, indifferent to the stares of passers-by. Rain was honest. It fell without disguise, without ceremony, and Nancy welcomed its unvarnished truth. In its steady rhythm, she heard an echo of her own relentless longing. One wonders if Nancy ever paused to ask herself whether love could truly give her what she sought. Was she looking for companionship, or was she searching for a reflection of her own defiance? Perhaps she loved most fiercely those who could never fully give themselves, for their elusiveness kept her hunger alive. Or perhaps she simply refused to settle, preferring storms to still waters, even if storms left her battered. These questions remain, unresolved like the dissonant chords that often closed her poems. Yet whatever the answer, love was central to her rebellion. To love across boundaries of class, to take lovers without shame, to choose passion over duty. These acts shocked the world that had expected her to marry within wealth, to bear heirs, to host dinners as her mother had. Instead, Nancy's romances became their own form of politics, an assertion that a woman's body and heart were her own, not possessions of society or family. Each affair was scandal not because of its excess, but because it was chosen freely. And so the rain continues, falling upon the city as Nancy walks alone through the streets, her shoes damp, her bracelets ringing faintly with each step. She carries within her the fire of romance, both its brilliance and its destruction. Behind her, the echoes of arguments and embraces still cling to the air, but ahead lies another storm, larger and more consuming, the storm of politics, where her passions will turn from personal defiance to public struggle. For even as rain soaks the streets of Paris, a greater storm is gathering across Europe, and Nancy's rebellion will soon find itself drawn into battlefields and manifestos. The sound of rain fades into silence, and with it dawn begins to break over another land, another struggle, another chapter of her life. It is the silence of a battlefield at first light, where the world holds its breath before the storm of war. The rain fades into silence, and from that silence there emerges another sound, low and steady. The silence of a battlefield at dawn, when the air seems to hold its breath before the violence begins. For Nancy Cunard, the storms of love and the tempests of poetry soon widened into a storm larger than herself, one that stretched across nations. The Spain she entered was not the Spain of tourists or salons, but of hunger, of barricades, of a people caught between the weight of dictatorship and the fragile hope of freedom. The Spanish Civil War had begun, and Nancy, who had long resisted the private prisons of wealth and convention, now found herself drawn into a struggle where rebellion was not only personal, but historical. She traveled south with determination, carrying not the complacency of a visitor, but the urgency of a witness. The roads were lined with refugees, men and women carrying bundles of clothes, children clinging to their arms, faces gaunt from fear. Villages bore scars of bombings, churches shattered, fields burned. The air smelled of smoke and dust, of sweat and despair. Nancy moved among these scenes not as a detached onlooker, but as one compelled to act. The defiance she had nurtured in poetry and in scandal now turned outward, into solidarity with those who had nothing, those whose survival depended not on inheritance, but on courage. In Spain, she met soldiers of the international brigades, volunteers who had come from distant countries to fight fascism. They were teachers, laborers, poets, and wanderers, men and women who believed that Spain was the front line of a battle that would decide the fate of Europe. Their accents mingled in the camps, their clothes ragged, their spirits fierce. Nancy spoke with them, listened to their stories, carried their words back to the outside world. She was struck by their devotion, their willingness to sacrifice, their certainty that the world could not stand still while tyranny advanced. She also met the women of Spain, mothers who had lost sons, wives who carried rifles, children who ran messages through ruined streets. Their faces etched themselves into her memory, reminders that war was not only fought by soldiers, but borne by the nameless, the poor, the unarmed. To her, these women represented a truth deeper than politics, that dignity could endure even amid destruction, that humanity persisted in the smallest gestures of care. Nancy's letters and writings from this time burn with urgency. She pleaded with friends in England and France to recognize the danger of fascism, to see Spain not as a distant quarrel, but as a warning of the darkness to come. She raised money for medical supplies, helped refugees find passage, used her voice and her name to rally attention. Her privilege, which she had so long resented, now became a tool she wielded deliberately, turning the weight of Cunard into leverage for justice. She understood that society might ignore the cries of the poor, but it would not ignore the scandalous heiress. If her notoriety could save lives, she would use it without hesitation. But Spain was not only a place of action, it was also a place of despair. She saw executions carried out in the shadows of villages, heard the sobs of mothers over shallow graves, watched the tide of war shift again and again. Each defeat weighed on her spirit. Each betrayal by governments outside Spain deepened her anger. The world, she felt, was closing its eyes, and in that blindness, fascism gathered strength. Her writing became sharper, more insistent, no longer the fragments of a restless soul, but the manifestos of a witness demanding attention. She wrote of blood on the ground, of bodies unburied, of the silence of those who could have acted but chose instead to wait. The personal and the political intertwined as they always had in Nancy's life. Her affairs did not end with Spain. She loved still, fiercely and dangerously, but love itself was now charged with the urgency of survival. Letters of intimacy were scrawled alongside letters of protest, embraces exchanged in moments snatched between alarms. The war pressed upon every breath, every gesture. To love in such times was itself an act of defiance, proof that tenderness could exist even amid ruin. Her friends in Paris and London did not always understand. Some dismissed her activism as another scandal, another performance. Others praised her courage but failed to follow her example. Nancy felt increasingly isolated, caught between worlds, too radical for the safety of salons, too privileged to ever fully belong among the dispossessed. Yet she pressed on, driven less by belonging than by conviction. She had seen with her own eyes, and to remain silent would have been impossible. The Spanish Civil War marked a turning point. For Nancy, rebellion was no longer merely aesthetic, no longer confined to fashion, poetry, or scandal. It was now a matter of life and death, a fight against forces that threatened not only Spain, but all of Europe. Her passion, once poured into love affairs and verses, now surged into politics, into activism, into cries that would echo across borders. She became not only a poet, but a voice of resistance, her bracelets clattering now not in salons, but in refugee camps, her presence a reminder that even the daughter of wealth could stand against tyranny. And yet, the war pressed on, brutal and unrelenting. Nancy watched as hope flickered and faltered, as victories dissolved into defeats, as friends were lost to bullets and betrayals. The weight of it pressed upon her, deepening the shadows in her eyes, etching lines into her face. Still she carried on. Still she wrote. Still she refused to surrender. To give up would have been to betray not only Spain but herself, the restless child who had longed for truth amid the silence of wealth. As dawn breaks over a battlefield, the light falls not only on soldiers, but on ruins, on bodies, on the silence that follows gunfire. Nancy stands within that silence, her figure slender, her bracelets gleaming faintly, her eyes fixed not on the ground but on the horizon. For even in despair she looked forward, believing that resistance was never in vain, even if victory seemed impossible. And so the silence of the battlefield carries us onward into the days when Nancy's politics would broaden still further, when her voice would turn not only toward Spain, but toward the wider fight for equality, for justice across race and nation. The silence deepens, and within it there begins the faint, muffled beat of a drum, distant yet insistent, as though summoning her to the next struggle. The silence of the battlefield lingers, but from its depths there arises a sound more human, more enduring than the roar of artillery. It is the muffled beat of a drum, faint at first, like a heartbeat carried from afar. As it grows, it leads us away from the dust of Spain and toward another realm of Nancy Cunard's rebellion, one that would bind her life not only to Europe's struggles, but to the rhythms of another world. The drumbeat belonged to Harlem, to jazz, to voices long silenced by empire and race, and Nancy heard it as a call she could not ignore. Even before Spain, she had felt drawn to the music that emerged from Black communities, first in London and then more powerfully in Paris. The 1920s and 30s had brought waves of African American musicians to Europe, fleeing the oppression of segregation in the United States and carrying with them the brilliance of jazz. Paris welcomed them with open arms, and in the smoky clubs of Montmartre and Montparnasse, their sounds remade the night. Brass instruments wailed, drums pounded, pianos clattered with syncopated rhythm. For Nancy, who had always sought authenticity beneath the surface of things, this music was revelation. It spoke of joy and sorrow entwined, of survival, of creativity forged in oppression. The world she had known as a child, gilded rooms, rehearsed rituals, the silence of privilege, had never carried such rhythms. Here was something alive, untamed, immediate. Jazz was not concerned with refinement, it was concerned with truth. Each improvisation was defiance, a refusal to be caged. Nancy, whose own life had been one long refusal, recognized in it a spirit that matched her own. She began to spend more time in the clubs, her pale figure conspicuous in the crowd, her bracelets ringing faintly as she clapped along. Some were scandalized, an English heiress mingling so openly with musicians, dancers, men, and women of color. To Nancy, the scandal was not her presence, but the prejudice that condemned it. It was in this world that she met Henry Crowder, the African-American jazz pianist, whose music flowed with both playfulness and melancholy. Their connection was immediate, born not only of attraction but of shared recognition. Nancy saw in him a defiance of the world's injustice, and Henry saw in her a rare refusal to submit to convention. Their affair shocked polite society, for it crossed lines of race, class, and empire. But for Nancy, it was not rebellion for its own sake. It was simply love, lived without apology. The criticism that followed, the whispers in salons, the rejection from her own family only hardened her resolve. If the world condemned such love, then the world itself was to be condemned. Her bond with Crowder deepened her awareness of racial injustice, not only in America, but across the colonial empires of Europe. She saw clearly the hypocrisy of nations that proclaimed civilization while exploiting millions, the cruelty of systems that denied dignity to those whose art she admired, whose humanity was undeniable. Out of this awareness grew her most ambitious project, the Negro Anthology, a vast collection of writings, poems, essays, and testimonies from Black voices around the world. The work consumed her. She sought contributions from Harlem Renaissance poets, from African intellectuals, from Caribbean activists, from scholars and musicians who spoke of slavery, segregation, resistance, and culture. She poured her own money into the project, pawning her jewels, selling her possessions, determined to bring these voices into one book that would challenge Europe to listen. It was an act of devotion and of defiance, for few at the time believed that such voices deserved a platform in the salons of Europe. Nancy ignored the doubters. She worked tirelessly, corresponding with writers, editing manuscripts, assembling fragments into a chorus. The result, published in 1934, was monumental. It contained essays on history and slavery, poems of protest, stories of survival, studies of music and dance. It was not only a book, but a declaration that Black voices mattered, that they carried wisdom and creativity essential to the modern world. Nancy wrote in her introduction that Europe could no longer afford to remain ignorant of the realities of race and empire. It was a challenge, and it did not go unanswered. The anthology was praised by some, dismissed by others, attacked by racists who saw in it a betrayal. For Nancy, it was perhaps her greatest act of rebellion, to use her fortune and her notoriety not for her own glory, but to amplify others. And yet the project also drained her. It cost her wealth she could not easily replace, and it deepened the rift with her family, who could not comprehend why their daughter would sacrifice her inheritance for voices they considered beneath notice. But Nancy was not moved by their disapproval. She believed that to live authentically, one must act upon one's convictions, even at personal cost. Her bracelets clattered as she turned the pages of the anthology, as though the metal itself carried the echoes of chains, broken, voices freed. Her activism did not stop with the book. She continued to speak out against racial injustice, to write letters, to protest the complacency of Europe. She invited musicians and writers into her home, mingling worlds that society insisted must remain separate. She lived her life as a demonstration, refusing to conceal her love for Henry Crowder, refusing to apologize for her friendships, refusing to remain silent about injustice. Still, the cost was high. Society's condemnation weighed upon her, her family disowned her, and even some of her friends in artistic circles distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their reputations. But Nancy had long ago chosen isolation over compromise. She had made of herself an exile from wealth, a stranger to convention, and in that exile she found a kind of truth. The muffled beat of the drum continues, not fading but growing louder, as if summoning her further still. From the music of Harlem to the anthology's pages, from love to activism, Nancy's rebellion expanded until it encompassed more than herself. She had made her body a scandal, her fashion a protest, her poetry a refusal, and now her fortune itself had become a weapon against silence. And yet, beyond the beat of the drum, there remains another sound. Faint, unresolved, the low vibration of a piano chord, struck but not finished. It hangs in the air like a question, waiting for its answer. It is the sound of her love for Henry Crowder, the music of their union, the controversy that would deepen still further, testing both her convictions and her heart. The unresolved piano chord hangs in the air, vibrating faintly as though waiting for release, and from that lingering sound arises the figure of Henry Crowder, seated at the keys, his fingers poised, his eyes deep with music that seemed to come from a place Nancy could only glimpse but never fully enter. Their love, born in the smoke of Paris clubs and the rhythms of jazz, became both a sanctuary and a scandal, a union that carried tenderness and defiance in equal measure. For Nancy, Henry was not only a lover, but a revelation, proof that life could be lived across boundaries others declared impassable. For society, however, their affair was an outrage, a transgression against race, class, and empire. Crowder was a pianist whose music carried both joy and sorrow, each note shaped by the long history of his people, by the struggles of African Americans who faced prejudice abroad as well as at home. To Nancy, his music was the sound of authenticity, of survival transformed into beauty. In him, she found a partner whose presence illuminated the emptiness of the wealth she had rejected. Their love was not a passing distraction. It was a profound connection that reshaped her life. Yet because of the world they inhabited, it was also burdened with hostility. Her family recoiled, her mother in particular denouncing the relationship with bitter cruelty. Friends whispered, newspapers hinted, strangers stared. Nancy, who had long thrived on scandal, now faced condemnation not simply for her choices in love, but for challenging the very structure of racial prejudice. But Nancy refused to hide. She appeared publicly with Crowder, walked beside him into clubs and cafes, invited him into spaces where no one of his color had ever been welcome. The clatter of her bracelets became like a shield against disapproval, a sound that declared she would not bow to convention. In letters, she defended their union fiercely, arguing that love itself was a form of justice, that to deny it on grounds of race was a crime against humanity. Henry, for his part, accepted both the passion and the burden of their bond, though he knew the dangers it carried. He was a musician accustomed to navigating prejudice, but with Nancy he stepped into a glare of notoriety more intense than he had ever known. Their relationship was both intimate and political. In loving him, Nancy confronted the deepest hypocrisies of her class and her nation. She saw more clearly than ever the structures of power that divided human beings into categories of privilege and exclusion. Her work on the Negro Anthology was inseparable from her love for Crowder, for it was through him that she deepened her understanding of Black life, of art born in struggle, of histories long silenced. Together they argued about race and justice, about music and literature, about the possibility of a world less bound by prejudice. Their conversations, like their love, were charged with both tenderness and fire. But such love carried strain. The hostility they faced from society pressed upon them, and even within their intimacy lay tensions. Nancy, intense and demanding, often overwhelmed those she loved with the force of her passion. Crowder, while devoted, carried his own battles, the weariness of a man who had endured discrimination his entire life. There were quarrels, there was distance, yet through it all there remained a bond neither could deny. For Nancy, to love Henry was to live truthfully, even if truth brought suffering. For Henry, to love Nancy was to share in both her devotion and her restlessness. The piano chord lingers in her memory, a symbol of what they shared, unresolved, complex, vibrating with beauty and dissonance at once. In letters and poems, Nancy wrote of their love with urgency, describing him not only as a man, but as a force of life, a rhythm that carried her beyond herself. She refused to speak of him in hushed tones or to reduce their union to secrecy. Instead, she made it public, deliberate, a declaration that love need not bow to prejudice. In this, she scandalized her peers more deeply than ever before. For while her previous affairs had been shocking in their intensity, this one threatened the very hierarchies upon which society rested. Her mother's rejection was absolute. Lady Emerald, whose salons had once sparkled with musicians and artists, could not accept her daughter's union with a black man. She withdrew affection, withdrew support, and cast Nancy further into exile from her family. But Nancy did not waver. She had long known that to live authentically meant to accept loneliness, and she embraced that fate once more. Better to lose her mother's approval than to betray her heart. The world outside, however, grew darker. Fascism was rising across Europe, its voices echoing the same prejudices Nancy and Henry defied in their love. As she walked with him through the streets of Paris, as they listened to the music in crowded clubs, as they spoke late into the night of art and politics, Nancy knew their bond was more than personal. It was a symbol, a living contradiction to the ideology of hate spreading across borders. And so their love became both fragile and monumental, a private tenderness pressed upon by the weight of history. There are accounts of them traveling together, Nancy always by his side, her bracelets glinting, her gaze unyielding against the stares they attracted. She insisted upon dignity, upon walking proudly, even when the cost was insult or isolation. To be seen with him was not only to declare love, but to declare resistance. And resistance, as always, became the core of her being. But love, however courageous, cannot erase the weight of the world. Their bond faced strains from without and within, and though it endured for years, it carried with it the melancholy of unresolved chords. Nancy's passion sometimes overwhelmed Henry, her intensity demanding more than he could always give. He, weary of battles fought on so many fronts, sometimes withdrew, leaving her to wrestle with loneliness even within intimacy. And yet, despite these tensions, their story remains one of the defining chapters of her life. A love that carried both scandal and truth. A love that mirrored her rebellion against every boundary imposed upon her. As the piano chord fades at last into silence, we are left with its resonance, unresolved, echoing long after the key has been struck. It leads us toward another sound, softer but insistent, the turning of pages as Nancy gathers the voices she has collected, binding them into her great work, the Negro Anthology, the book that would outlast even the scandals of her love. The piano chord fades at last, leaving behind only its trembling resonance, and in that silence another sound emerges, softer but insistent, the slow turning of pages in the half-dark. For Nancy Cunard, those pages were not only her own, but the voices of countless others, gathered from across oceans and histories, assembled into what would become her great labor, the Negro Anthology. It was more than a book, more than a collection of essays and poems and studies. It was a monument of listening, of amplification, of defiance against a world that preferred silence where suffering had been, and ignorance where history had unfolded. Nancy worked tirelessly at it, her desk often crowded with letters, manuscripts, photographs, each one a fragment of a life that would find its place within the volume. She corresponded with poets of Harlem, with historians of Africa, with activists in the Caribbean. She read accounts of slavery and of freedom, of music and of struggle, of exile and survival. Each piece of writing was to her like another heartbeat, another drum echoing across the silence of Europe. She understood that this anthology was not hers alone, but belonged to a multitude, a chorus of voices long denied their rightful place. It was a monumental undertaking. She financed it herself, pawning her jewelry, selling her belongings, using what remained of her fortune to pay printers and editors. Every page she compiled carried with it a personal sacrifice, the tangible evidence of her willingness to dismantle her inheritance in service of truth. Where others collected jewels or properties, Nancy collected testimonies. She saw in them a treasure more lasting than gold, a wealth that could not be measured in the language of her ancestors' shipping fortune. The work consumed her days and nights. She read manuscripts until her eyes burned, wrote letters until her hand cramped, edited passages with the precision of one who knew the weight of words. Friends who visited her saw a woman exhausted, yet driven, her bracelets chiming faintly as she shuffled through papers, her voice animated by the urgency of her mission. Some admired her dedication, others dismissed it as another eccentricity, a whim of the heiress who sought scandal. But Nancy knew it was more. To her, this anthology was both an act of love, born of her connection to Henry Crowder and to the music that had transformed her, and an act of justice, a rebellion against the silence that had always been imposed upon Black voices. When the book was finally published in 1934, it was immense in size and scope. It contained essays on African history, studies of slavery and its legacy, poems from Harlem Renaissance figures, analyses of music and art, testimonies from activists. It was a mosaic, a tapestry woven from voices across continents. Nancy herself wrote an introduction that was both manifesto and plea, insisting that Europe could no longer remain ignorant of these realities. The book was heavy to hold, not only in weight but in meaning. It was as if the centuries themselves had been bound into its pages. The reception was mixed. Among those who recognized its value, it was hailed as groundbreaking, a rare acknowledgement of the richness of Black culture and the brutality of racism. Scholars and activists praised her vision. Musicians and poets found themselves honored and astonished to see their work presented in such a volume. But the wider world was less generous. Many critics ignored it, dismissing it as too unwieldy, too radical. Others condemned it openly, denouncing Nancy for wasting her fortune on what they considered unworthy material. For her family, it was yet another scandal, proof that their daughter had turned her back on everything they held dear. But Nancy did not measure success in praise. The very existence of the anthology was victory enough. She had created a space where voices silenced by centuries could speak, where testimonies erased by empire could be read. To her, this was worth more than approval. She knew that books could outlast scandal, that pages could endure when reputations crumbled, and so she accepted the isolation, the criticism, the exhaustion. The Negro Anthology was her answer to a world that had taught her rebellion must not remain only personal, but must become collective. Still, the cost was real. The financial burden left her nearly ruined, her health weakened by overwork. There were nights when she sat alone at her desk, the pages surrounding her like companions, and felt the weight of her choices pressing upon her. The voices she had gathered gave her strength, but the loneliness of her own life deepened. Love with Henry remained complicated, society's rejection constant, her family's estrangement final. Yet in the quiet turning of the anthology's pages, she found consolation. Each page whispered back to her, "You are not alone." The book also solidified her path as an activist. Once published, she could no longer retreat into the world of private poetry or fleeting affairs. She had declared herself publicly, irrevocably, as one who stood against racial prejudice and for justice. The anthology became a threshold, a line she had crossed, after which her life would never again be simply about art or fashion or scandal. It had become political in the deepest sense, a rebellion not only against her family and class, but against the structures of empire itself. And so, as she turned the last page of the anthology, as the ink dried and the binding settled, Nancy found herself at another threshold. The book lay heavy in her hands, a testimony to her devotion and her defiance. She closed it gently, as one might close the eyes of the dead, and listen to the silence it left behind. But silence, for Nancy, was never lasting. From within it arose once again the sound of keys striking, not of a piano this time, but of a typewriter, sharp and insistent, the beginning of another phase where her words would move from poetry and anthology into the urgency of letters and manifestos, her voice raised ever louder against injustice. The pages closed softly, their weight still resting in her hands, and from that stillness there comes a new sound, sharper and more urgent. The steady clatter of typewriter keys, each strike a declaration, each word pressed into the page with force enough to echo beyond the room. For Nancy Cunard, the typewriter became not merely a tool, but a weapon. Her voice sharpened into letters, manifestos, and pleas sent across borders. The anthology had gathered voices together, but her correspondence scattered them outward like sparks, each page igniting somewhere new, each sentence demanding a reply from a world reluctant to listen. She wrote endlessly, as if words could hold back the tide that threatened to engulf Europe. Letters to friends, letters to editors, letters to governments, and to strangers who might be persuaded to act. Her sentences rarely meandered. They pressed forward with urgency, driven by the conviction that silence was complicity. Those who received them often remarked on the intensity of her voice, the way she seemed to demand attention even through the flat medium of ink. She pleaded for aid to Spain, for recognition of the struggles of refugees, for awareness of the growing threat of fascism. And when she did not plead, she accused, her words biting, exposing hypocrisy, shaming those who preferred comfort to courage. The typewriter became her companion in solitude. Long after midnight, when the cafes had emptied and even the jazz clubs had grown quiet, her room still rang with the staccato rhythm of keys. Cigarette smoke curled above her, glasses of wine grew warm and forgotten at her side. Bracelets clinked faintly as she struck each letter with impatient force. She wrote as though each page might be her last, as though each letter carried the weight of life and death. And in truth, for those to whom she wrote, it often did. Refugees depended on her appeals. Causes relied on her persistence. Prisoners looked to her words as proof that they were not entirely abandoned. Her correspondence revealed both her brilliance and her isolation. For while she reached many through her letters, she also alienated others. Friends who admired her in youth grew weary of her constant demands. Editors who welcomed her fire at first grew reluctant to publish her relentless attacks. Some accused her of hysteria, of exaggeration, of being consumed by causes too vast to manage. But Nancy had little patience for such dismissals. She knew what she had seen in Spain, in the colonies, in the lives of those oppressed, and she refused to soften her words to make them more palatable. To dilute truth was, to her, the same as lying. There were moments, however, when exhaustion overcame her. She would stop suddenly, her fingers hovering above the keys, the silence pressing heavily against her ears. In those pauses, she felt the weight of her solitude, the distance between herself and those she once called family, the gulf between her convictions and the indifference of the world. The typewriter on her desk seemed almost accusatory in its silence, waiting for her to strike the keys again, and she always did. For to stop was unthinkable. To stop was to betray not only herself, but those whose voices she had pledged to carry. Her letters often mingled the personal and the political. She wrote of her health, of her loneliness, of her despair, and then shifted seamlessly into appeals for justice. To her, there was no division between the self and the world. The pain of one was bound to the pain of the other. Her affairs, her illnesses, her friendships, all were woven into the same fabric as her activism. This intimacy made her letters powerful, for they carried not only arguments, but a soul laid bare. She demanded action not as an abstract duty, but as something that mattered to her personally, urgently, desperately. And yet, despite the breadth of her correspondence, she remained haunted by the fear that her words fell into silence. Too often letters went unanswered, appeals ignored, promises unfulfilled. Each time the silence deepened her sense of futility. Was she shouting into a void? Were her efforts merely the gestures of a woman determined to resist, but doomed to fail? These questions gnawed at her, but still she returned to the typewriter, as though the act of writing itself were resistance, even if the world refused to reply. There is an image of Nancy at her desk that lingers in memory, her hair disheveled, her bracelet slipping down her thin arms, her face illuminated by a lamp, eyes fierce and weary, cigarette burning between her fingers as she strikes the keys with relentless force. In that image lies the essence of her existence, rebellion transformed into words, passion hardened into letters, solitude turned into weapon. It is both inspiring and tragic, for it reveals the depth of her commitment and the toll it exacted. One evening, as she wrote, the keys suddenly stopped. Her hand hovered, her mind exhausted, her body aching. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, filled with the ghosts of the words she had yet to write. It was a silence not of peace, but of weariness, of the body giving way before the will. She leaned back, listening to the stillness, and for a moment it seemed as though the world had ended, as though her voice had finally been extinguished. But beyond that silence, another sound soon emerged, the echo of boots upon cobblestones, heavy and ominous, the march of war approaching with steps that would shake all of Europe. The silence of the stopped typewriter presses heavily on the room, but from that pause rises another sound, darker and more inexorable, the echo of boots on cobblestones, measured and relentless, the march of war moving ever closer. For Nancy Cunard, words had long been her chosen weapon, but as Europe descended into chaos, she discovered that words alone could not hold back the tide. The rumble of fascism that she had warned of in letters and manifestos now shook the very ground, and she was thrust into the grim necessity of direct action. The world she had struggled to awaken was finally awake, but too late, and now every life became entangled in the machinery of war. She had no illusions about the dangers. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Europe was no longer a stage for avant-garde experiment or poetic quarrels. It was a battlefield of ideologies where the consequences were measured in corpses and ruins. Nancy threw herself into the work of resistance with the same intensity she had given to poetry and activism before, but now the stakes were absolute. She assisted refugees fleeing persecution, using her contacts, her dwindling resources, her very name to help them cross borders and escape the tightening noose of fascist regimes. She carried letters, money, supplies, whatever could be moved under the watchful eyes of authorities. Where once she had carried notebooks of poems, now she carried lists of names, routes of escape, fragments of fragile hope. The boots on the cobblestones were not abstractions to her. She saw them in the streets of France, in towns occupied, in villages emptied. Soldiers passed with rifles and uniforms, their steps pounding like a drumbeat of oppression. Nancy stood against them, not with armies, but with the stubborn persistence of one who refused to yield. She spoke openly against fascism in times when such words could cost a life. She was harassed, threatened, spied upon, yet she would not be silenced. For Nancy, to remain silent was to collaborate, and she could not bear such guilt. Her role was not glamorous. She did not lead troops or win battles. Instead, she moved quietly, helping where she could, sheltering those in danger, carrying news across perilous borders. She witnessed the suffering of refugees firsthand, families separated, children wandering alone, faces hollowed by hunger and fear. To her, each life was a rebuke to the complacency of the world, each story another reminder of why she could not stop. She felt in these people the same authenticity she had always sought, the raw truth of survival, unmasked by wealth or pretense. To be among them was to be among reality itself, and though the reality was terrible, she would rather face it than retreat to the comforts of ignorance. Her correspondence during these years shifted tone. Where once her letters had carried urgency, laced with despair, now they burned with direct appeals, with practical instructions, with details of aid. She wrote not only to plead for justice, but to arrange it, not only to warn, but to act. And yet, even in these most practical of writings, her voice retained its intensity, her sentences pulsing with the conviction that she would not stand idle while the world collapsed. Friends sometimes feared for her, begged her to be cautious, to step back, to preserve herself. But Nancy had never learned caution. To her, life without engagement was already a form of death. The war also deepened her loneliness. Many of those she had loved were gone, scattered by exile, claimed by violence, lost to the disintegration of Europe. Letters returned unanswered. Familiar places stood empty. Her own health began to falter under the strain of constant work, of inadequate food, of restless nights filled with the sounds of marching and bombardment. Yet she pressed on, skeletal at times, coughing in the cold, her bracelet slipping loosely around arms grown thin. She had sacrificed nearly everything, fortune, family, reputation, and now she gave her strength, her body itself, to the cause of resistance. It is difficult to know how she endured. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps conviction, perhaps the sheer inability to do otherwise. She had built her life upon defiance, and to cease now would have been to betray not only the refugees and comrades who depended on her, but also the restless child she had once been, wandering the halls of wealth, longing for truth. That child had grown into a woman who had found truth, though it came in the form of ruin and war. There are stories of her walking through occupied towns, her presence incongruous, her bracelets clattering faintly, her gaze sharp. To the soldiers she must have seemed eccentric, perhaps harmless. But beneath that exterior lay the courage of one who had nothing left to lose. She continued to write, continued to carry, continued to resist, even when the odds were hopeless. For Nancy, resistance was never about victory alone. It was about dignity, about refusing to bow, about preserving humanity in the face of its negation. And yet the toll was immense. Her body weakened further, her spirit burdened by the endless tide of loss. She witnessed executions, bombings, the endless procession of refugees. Each sight etched itself into her memory, deepening the shadows in her eyes. She could not save them all, she could barely save a few. And sometimes she wondered, in moments of despair, whether her efforts mattered at all. Was she merely throwing herself against a wall that could not be broken? But even in those questions, she never stopped. For Nancy, to question was human, but to surrender was impossible. The echo of boots on cobblestones grows fainter as the years of war drag on, but it never disappears entirely. It becomes part of the rhythm of her existence, the backdrop against which she moves. And as the war grinds forward, Nancy herself begins to falter, her health unraveling, her strength dissipating, though her conviction remains unshaken. The boots fade at last into silence, leaving behind only the echo of her coughing in an empty room, her body frail, her voice still fierce, her life marked by sacrifice. From the heavy tread of soldiers, we move now into the fragile, rasping breath of a woman who has given nearly all, yet who continues, even in illness, to resist. The boots fade into silence, and what remains in the dimness is another sound, more fragile yet no less insistent, the cough of a woman alone in an empty room, a cough that breaks the night like an unwelcomed guest. It is Nancy's own body now that betrays her, weakened by hunger, weariness, and years of sleepless nights spent writing, organizing, and resisting. Once she had defied society with laughter, with scandal, with bracelets that rang like a proclamation of freedom. Now she faced the betrayal of flesh, a reminder that even rebellion must answer to mortality. The war pressed upon her not only in politics and violence, but in her own lungs, her own blood. She had given away what fortune remained, poured out her strength on causes too vast for one life to sustain, and the cost was now exacted from her bones and sinew. Yet she did not stop. Even coughing, she wrote letters. Even trembling, she walked streets scarred by bombardment. Friends who glimpsed her during these years spoke of a figure gaunt, eyes darkened with shadows, her bracelets slipping loosely on arms that had grown thin. But they also spoke of her fire, a refusal that still flickered despite her decline. She continued to write poems, though now they bore the mark of exhaustion. The verses were fractured, brief, urgent, more like fragments of breath than completed works. In them one can feel both her despair and her persistence, the sense that she was fading, but also that fading was no excuse to surrender. Her poems spoke of ruins, of silence, of the weight of war upon the soul, but within them was also defiance, the insistence that to write at all, however broken the lines, was itself resistance. Alcohol, too, became her companion, its warmth both a solace and a burden. She drank to numb the ache of her body, to quiet the despair of watching Europe collapse, to silence the doubts that whispered of futility. Yet the relief it brought was fleeting, and the next morning brought only greater weakness, deeper coughing, the tremor of hands that had once written with fierce precision. Some judged her harshly for it, dismissing her decline as self-destruction. But what else could one do when the world itself seemed intent on destruction? Perhaps her drinking was not merely escape, but a mirror of the ruin around her, a body echoing the collapse of nations. In her solitude, she was haunted by ghosts. Friends lost to war, lovers absent, causes betrayed. Spain still lived in her memory, the fields and villages she had seen burned, the comrades who had died unremembered. Henry Crowder, too, drifted further from her life, their love unable to withstand the weight of politics, scandal, and personal strain. She had loved with the same intensity that she had fought, but love, like resistance, carried its own exhaustion. And so she lived largely alone, surrounded not by companions, but by memories and by papers scattered across her room. Still, she did not fall silent. Her typewriter, though used less often, still carried her voice into the world. She wrote appeals, though fewer answered them. She wrote poems, though fewer read them. Yet the act itself remained essential, a way of breathing through the coughs, a way of declaring, even in decline, that she was still alive, still herself. To stop writing would have been to accept invisibility, and Nancy had spent her life refusing that fate. The war's violence pressed closer and closer. She saw bombed streets, bodies left unburied, the eyes of children hollow with hunger. Each image cut into her, each scene deepened the wound of despair. And yet, within those ruins, she also saw fragments of humanity that sustained her. A woman sharing bread with a stranger, a soldier offering water to an enemy, a child laughing despite hunger. These small gestures, unnoticed by history, became to her proof that dignity persisted, that even amid collapse, there remained something worth preserving. She wrote of such moments, fragments of light amid darkness, her own way of recording that the world had not surrendered entirely. But her body grew frailer. The coughing worsened, her strength diminished. She wandered less often, remaining more in her rooms, her bracelets chiming only faintly as she moved. Those who saw her were struck by how diminished she seemed, yet within her gaze there still burned a sharpness, a refusal to soften. She was not resigned, though she was exhausted. She was not at peace, though she longed for rest. She was simply continuing as she always had, moving forward even when the path led only deeper into shadow. The image of Nancy in these years is haunting, a figure once radiant, now worn, yet still fierce. A woman who had turned her back on wealth and privilege, now living in near poverty. A poet who had fought for justice, now coughing alone in rooms filled with papers. It is tempting to see only tragedy in this, but to Nancy, tragedy itself was never reason enough to cease. She embodied the paradox of resistance, that one may be broken and yet remain unyielding, frail and yet still defiant. The cough echoes again in the empty room, harsher now, resonant in the silence that follows. It is the sound of a body failing, but a spirit persisting. From that cough, the air shifts, and through the half-open window we hear another sound, curtains fluttering in the breeze, their fabric stirring though no one enters. The open window becomes a threshold, a sign of her isolation, a reminder of absences that will only grow. The curtains ripple softly at the open window, their fabric lifting and falling in the night air like the breath of a ghost. And in that gentle flutter, there is a reminder of absence. No one enters the room, no one crosses the threshold. Nancy lies within, frail but still restless, watching the shifting light as though it were a language only she could read. The breeze carries with it the sense of the outside world, damp stone, smoke from distant chimneys, the faint perfume of flowers from some unseen garden. Yet none of these reach her fully, for she is trapped in the narrowing confines of her own body, her own solitude. Illness had become her companion now, as much as her typewriter once was. Her lungs, strained by years of smoke, of cold, of ceaseless exertion, weakened further with each passing season. The cough that once interrupted her sentences now dominated them, carving its way into her days and nights. She grew thinner, her skin pale, her frame so slight that the bracelets she loved seemed heavy upon her arms. Yet she did not discard them. The clatter of their metal remained, faint and delicate, a reminder of the woman who had once startled society with her defiance. Friends, those who had not drifted entirely away, came seldom. Some feared her intensity, some had been alienated by her unrelenting demands, and some simply could not face the sight of her decline. Those who did come were struck by the persistence of her mind. Though her voice faltered and her body weakened, her words retained their sharpness. She still argued, still pleaded, still criticized, though now from the confines of a chair or bed rather than the cafes and streets of Paris. In conversation, she would suddenly straighten, her eyes blazing, as though the force of her conviction alone could revive her. Letters, too, continued, though fewer than before. Each one took more effort, each word harder to press into the page. Yet she wrote them still, because to stop would have been to vanish entirely. In her handwriting, one can see the struggle. Lines uneven, words hurried, as if racing against the betrayal of her body. She wrote to friends, to editors, to strangers who might listen. She wrote of politics, of race, of war, of the failures of those in power. She also wrote of loneliness, though rarely directly, allowing it instead to seep through the edges of her sentences like water through cracked stone. Her relationship with her mother, always strained, seemed more distant than ever. Lady Emerald, still a figure of society, could not reconcile herself to the daughter who had abandoned fortune for scandal, poetry, and causes that seemed to her incomprehensible. Nancy, in her weakened state, sometimes recalled their quarrels with a mixture of anger and sorrow. She longed, perhaps, for tenderness that had never been given, for reconciliation that never came. Yet she knew such longing was futile. The curtain between herself and her family was heavier than the one that fluttered at her window, and it would never be drawn aside. It was during these years of illness that Nancy seemed to drift between memory and present, between the vibrancy of her past and the stillness of her decline. She recalled nights in Montparnasse, the smoke, the laughter, the music, the voices that had once surrounded her. She remembered Henry Crowder's piano, its notes lingering unresolved. She thought of Spain, of refugees, of the anthology whose pages had once filled her desk. These memories pressed upon her, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as torment, for they reminded her of what she had been, of what she had lost, of what she had given away. But memory alone could not sustain her. She was still alive, still present, and even in weakness she refused to submit entirely. There were days when she insisted on walking outside, her steps slow, her frame leaning, yet her chin lifted in defiance. Passers-by sometimes stared at the figure she had become, but Nancy met their eyes without flinching, as if daring them to judge. In such moments one glimpses the child she had once been, restless in the polished halls of wealth, unwilling to accept the role written for her. That spirit, though battered, had not entirely disappeared. The hospital became another stage in her decline. White corridors, the smell of antiseptic, the whisper of nurses' shoes along the floors. Here, too, she was restless, resistant to the routines imposed upon her. She argued with doctors, refused treatments, demanded books and letters instead of quiet. Other patients spoke of her presence, how she seemed both frail and indomitable, lying thin in her bed yet still insisting upon her own way. Some admired her strength, others found her difficult. But Nancy had never lived to please, and she would not begin in illness. Isolation deepened, however, for no matter her defiance, the body's betrayal could not be overcome by will alone. Nights stretched long, the cough returning, the air heavy with silence. Through the window the curtains fluttered, whispering of a world outside that moved on without her. In those hours, Nancy confronted the deepest solitude of her life. She who had once filled nights with laughter and argument, who had once been surrounded by lovers and friends, now lay listening to the thin breath of wind through fabric. It is tempting to view these years as only decline, as the slow extinguishing of a fire. Yet perhaps they also reveal another kind of strength. For Nancy did not retreat into comfort or reconciliation. She did not seek forgiveness or soften her voice. She remained herself to the end, difficult, demanding, relentless in her convictions. Illness stripped her body, but not her spirit. In the fluttering curtains at her window, one might see not only absence, but persistence, the reminder that even in solitude the air still moves, life still stirs, rebellion still whispers. The curtain lifts again, higher this time as though caught by a stronger gust, and through it comes another sound, distant but clear. The creak of a mast against the wind, the groan of wood and rope, as though some great ship were moving unseen. It carries with it the memory of her lineage, the fortune she abandoned, the family she defied. That creak lingers, leading us into the next chamber of her life, where memory of ships and family presses once more against the woman who had spent her years resisting them. The curtain lifts, and from its sway comes another sound, deeper, more ancient, the slow creak of a mast against the wind, the moan of rope straining where sail meets timber. It is the sound of ships, of oceans crossed, of the fortune upon which the Cunard name had been built. Though Nancy had spent her life in rebellion against that inheritance, it followed her like a shadow, an echo she could never quite silence. In illness, when memories returned with relentless clarity, she heard again the sounds of her childhood, the talk of voyages, the weight of a dynasty anchored not in poetry but in commerce, not in rebellion but in order. The ships were the symbols of her family's empire, the vessels that carried their fortune across the seas, and they loomed always behind her story, reminders of what she had rejected, of what she had left undone. Her father, Sir Bosch Cunard, had been quiet, almost spectral, a man who belonged more to the country and the hunt than to the grandeur of society. He had little sway in her life, and his presence often felt as muted as the echo of ships heard from afar. Her mother, Lady Emerald, by contrast, had been formidable. With her parties, her alliances, her dazzling manipulations of society, she carried the family name into the forefront of English culture. But to Nancy, she was a figure both admired and resented, a woman whose brilliance left little warmth for her daughter. Their relationship was one of perpetual strain, admiration battling with defiance, love soured by rejection. In her later years, Nancy thought often of her mother, the quarrels, the disappointments, the relentless pressure to conform. She remembered the silks chosen for her, the suitors presented, the relentless insistence that she play her part as an heiress. Yet she also remembered the brilliance of those salons, the music, the glitter, the sense of possibility that Lady Emerald conjured with ease. Nancy was, in some sense, her mother's daughter. Both women had a will of steel, both refused to disappear into the background. But where Lady Emerald wielded her force to preserve society, Nancy used hers to dismantle it. Mother and daughter mirrored each other in strength, yet stood opposed in vision, like two ships locked in opposite winds, never able to sail in harmony. When Nancy took Henry Crowder into her life, the final thread of their bond unraveled. Lady Emerald's rejection was swift and brutal, filled with the venom of both class prejudice and maternal disappointment. Nancy, already estranged, now became almost a stranger to her own blood. The Cunard fortune, vast and enduring, was closed to her. What might have been hers by birthright was denied, and Nancy accepted that exile with a mixture of defiance and bitterness. She had never wanted the weight of that inheritance, but the finality of its loss still stung. For to be disinherited is not merely to lose wealth. It is to be declared no longer kin. And yet, in illness, as she listened to the phantom creak of ships, she wondered if rebellion had brought her freedom, or only solitude. The wealth she had despised might have spared her suffering, might have eased her decline, might have offered comfort in her last years. But would it have preserved her soul? Would it have given her poetry, her activism, her passion for justice? Or would she have been silenced, another ornament of high society, her bracelets replaced by pearls, her voice reduced to politeness? The questions lingered, unresolved, as all profound questions do. The mast creaks again, the sound carrying both memory and accusation. Nancy knew that the Cunard ships, those great vessels that crossed the Atlantic, were themselves symbols of empire, of a system that had enriched her family while exploiting others. Her rejection of that fortune had been not only personal, but political, an act of renunciation against the structures of power. The anthology, the activism, the lovers, all had been ways of declaring her independence from that legacy. And yet she could not escape it entirely. The Cunard name followed her, appearing in newspapers, in whispers, in judgments. She was always the heiress, even as she lived in poverty, always the scandal, even as she sought justice. Her rebellion could never fully erase her origins. Sometimes, lying in bed, she thought of her childhood home, the polished halls, the scent of roses, the velvet chairs. She thought of her mother sweeping into rooms with brilliance, of her father fading quietly into the background. She thought of herself as a girl wandering corridors, already restless, already longing for something beyond. Those memories were sharp, and in them she saw both the prison and the spark of her future. Without that childhood, would she have become the woman she was? Without wealth to reject, would rebellion have burned so brightly? She did not know. Perhaps exile and privilege are forever intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. The creak of the mast grows louder, as if the ship itself were approaching, as if the legacy she had spent her life escaping had returned to claim her. But Nancy does not rise to meet it. She lies still, her bracelets faintly chiming as her arm shifts, her eyes fixed on the window where curtains flutter. The ship passes unseen, its sound fading into the distance once more. It leaves behind only the awareness of what was lost, of what was rejected, of what could never be reconciled. And from that fading sound comes another, softer but insistent. The toll of a bell in some distant town, its note carried on the wind, solemn and slow. It is not the bell of society, nor of ships, but of churches, foreign and familiar, marking time in places where Nancy had wandered in exile. The bell's sound leads us onward into the years of her rootless travels, when she drifted across countries, belonging nowhere, carrying her rebellion like a burden she could not put down. The bell tolls, slow and sonorous, carried on the wind from some unseen church tower, its sound lingering across empty streets, across hills and rivers, across places where Nancy wandered. The note does not belong to England nor to France, not to Spain nor to Italy, but to all and none. For by now Nancy had become a wanderer without anchor, a figure of exile who belonged everywhere only as a stranger. Her life, once a storm of cafes, manifestos, and scandals, had settled into a drifting without clear destination, each country a harbor where she stayed only briefly before the tides of restlessness or necessity carried her onward again. Italy was among her refuges, its light softer than the gray of London, its hills steeped in histories older than empire. She walked through stone villages where children played in dust and priests passed in silence, her bracelets jingling faintly, her figure conspicuous yet oddly unnoticed, as though the people sensed she was not of their world. She lingered in cheap lodgings, writing fragments of poetry, letters half-finished, thoughts that dissolved into silence. In cafes, she sat at corners sipping coffee, observing faces, listening to dialects she only half understood, filling the spaces of loneliness with the act of watching. Italy gave her beauty, the shimmer of olive trees, the scent of lemon groves, but it gave her no belonging. She was always the foreigner, always the woman adrift. In France, she felt both closer and farther from home. Paris had once been her stage, the place of laughter and scandal, of music and manifestos. But in her later years, the city seemed to hold only echoes. Streets where she had walked with Henry Crowder now carried only the memory of his steps. Cafes where she had argued with poets now seemed filled with strangers. She wandered them still, thin and frail, her eyes scanning for faces that would never return. To some, she was a ghost, the scandalous heiress of another era, remembered but no longer celebrated. To others, she was invisible, just another woman alone in the noise of the city. France was both familiar and alien, a place where her rebellion had once burned brightly, but where now only embers remained. England, her homeland, never ceased to be a place of estrangement. She returned sometimes, pulled by necessity, by the faint hope of reconciliation, by the longing that illness often awakens. But England gave her little welcome. The society that had once whispered of her scandal now preferred to forget her. The salons of her mother remained closed, the fortune still denied, the old friends long gone or unwilling to acknowledge her. The English countryside, with its fields and hedgerows, carried the smells of her childhood, the damp earth, the clipped grass, the roses in bloom. Yet these familiar scents offered no comfort. They reminded her only of what she had refused, of what she had lost. England was a mirror that showed her the cost of rebellion, but gave no solace in return. In all these places she lived as though passing through, never rooted, always carrying her life in fragments, papers, notebooks, bracelets, memories. She had no fixed home, no stable ground, only temporary rooms filled with the silence of exile. Yet in this rootlessness, there was also a strange freedom. She belonged nowhere, and so she was bound by nothing. No country could claim her. No society could contain her. She had become the embodiment of her own defiance, even as it left her vulnerable, weakened, alone. Her writings from this period reflect this drifting state. Poems unfinished, sentences that break mid-thought, essays that begin with fire and end in weariness. They are not works of triumph, but of persistence, records of a spirit that refused to extinguish entirely, even as the body faltered. In them, one feels both the loneliness of exile and the clarity it brings. For Nancy saw the world without the veils of belonging. She saw its hypocrisies, its cruelties, but also its fleeting beauty. A child's laughter on a street in Florence, the shadow of clouds over the Pyrenees, the toll of bells in an English village, all these she noted with the same intensity as she once gave to manifestos. Rootless, she was also receptive, open to every small fragment of existence. And yet one cannot live entirely on fragments. Exile wears upon the spirit. Without the grounding of companionship, of recognition, of belonging, life becomes a series of departures. Nancy felt this weight in her bones, in the constant weariness that no rest could relieve. She longed at times for home, though she no longer knew where home might be. She longed for love, though most of her lovers were gone. She longed for the fire of her earlier years, though it had been consumed by war and illness. What remained was persistence, stubborn and unyielding, a refusal to vanish even when the world seemed content to forget her. The tolling of the bell continues, each note fading into silence before the next begins. It marks not only the passing of hours, but the rhythm of Nancy's later life. Pauses of loneliness punctuated by brief moments of connection, long silences broken by fragments of memory. She carried within her the weight of all she had done, the poetry, the scandals, the anthology, the resistance. She also carried the burden of what she had lost, the family, the fortune, the lovers, the vitality of her body. Yet she remained herself unmistakably, even in exile. Her bracelet still clinked when she lifted her arm. Her eyes still held defiance. Her words still refused to soften. The bell tolls once more, and this time the sound seems to linger longer, as though carried across autumn air, mingled with the rustle of leaves that fall slowly from branches. The leaves scatter across cobblestones, their movement soft, restless, unclaimed by wind or soil. They carry us onward into the next stage of Nancy's wandering, where memory of lovers past returns with the rustling of leaves, and loss becomes the language of her late writing. The bell's final note fades into the air, and in its wake comes another sound, gentler but no less insistent. The rustle of leaves falling from branches, their crisp forms scattering across cobblestones, carried here and there by an indifferent breeze. It is autumn, and Nancy Cunard, drifting through the later years of her life, seems herself like one of those leaves, once bright in color, now fragile, moving without anchor, still touched by a strange beauty as she is carried along by winds beyond her control. Each fallen leaf is a memory, and as they scatter, they summon the figures of her past. Lovers, friends, comrades, each one once vivid, now only shadows, returning to her in fragments. She remembered them not in orderly sequence, but in sudden flashes, as though each rustling leaf were the whisper of a name. Ezra Pound, with his intensity and brilliance, once so alluring, later so compromised by politics and hate. She thought of his voice, how it had once carried her into new ways of writing, even as she recoiled from what he later became. Wyndham Lewis, sketching her sharp profile, fixing her as a figure of art while never granting her the recognition she demanded as a writer. Aldous Huxley, his words weaving her into characters, their intimacy a mixture of closeness and distance. André Breton, Louis Aragon, the surrealists with their manifestos, shouted into cafes, lovers and comrades whose tempests matched her own, whose ardor both nourished and exhausted her. And then Henry Crowder, perhaps the deepest shadow among them, the unresolved chord that never faded. She remembered his hands on the piano, the sound of his music filling rooms where their love had dared to exist against the condemnation of a world. She remembered arguments sharp as broken glass, reconciliations tender but brief, the unrelenting pressure of society's scorn. She remembered how her family had turned away from her, how friends had whispered, how newspapers had sneered. And she remembered, above all, the truth of her love for him, a truth she would not deny, even when it left her isolated. The memory of him lingered in her like an ache that time could not erase, a melody unfinished, echoing in every silence. In her later years, these figures returned to her like ghosts, not to comfort but to remind. They reminded her of what she had chosen, of what she had lost, of the intensity with which she had lived. There was sadness in these memories, yes, but also pride. She had loved fiercely, without apology, without concession. Each affair, each friendship had been an act of defiance against the prison of expectation. To the world, they were scandals. To Nancy, they were survival. And now, as the leaves rustled, she let them speak to her, not with the urgency of the past, but with the melancholy of distance. Her poetry from these years is marked by this sense of memory. The lines grew sparse, stripped of ornament, often little more than fragments of recollection. She wrote of absence, of silence, of the way love fades yet leaves its imprint. Her words were less fiery than before, but more distilled, as though each sentence carried the essence of her life's rebellion in miniature. Some of these poems were published, many were not. It did not matter to her as it once had. She no longer sought the approval of critics or the recognition of society. She wrote because the act itself kept her connected to the world, because to stop writing would have been to stop existing. Loneliness pressed upon her, however. The lovers were gone, the comrades scattered, the friends weary or lost to death. She lived largely in isolation, her rooms filled not with laughter, but with silence. The rustle of leaves outside her window seemed to echo that solitude, each one a reminder of departure, of endings. She walked streets alone, sat in cafes alone, wrote letters that sometimes went unanswered. Yet even in loneliness, she remained defiant. She did not soften into resignation, did not seek to return to the world she had left. She embraced her exile as the price of authenticity, as the inevitable consequence of having lived without compromise. Still, there were moments when she wondered, was rebellion worth the solitude it brought? Was defiance worth the cost of family, fortune, companionship? Could she have lived differently with less fire and found more peace? These questions haunted her in the small hours, when the streets outside were silent, when the only sound was the rustling of leaves against the window. But she never allowed them to undo her. Doubt was part of life, but surrender was not. She had chosen her path, and though it led into loneliness, it was hers. That, to her, was worth more than comfort. The autumn air carried with it sense of earth and decay, but also of renewal. Leaves fell, but beneath them, new shoots would one day rise. Nancy sensed this too. Though her own life neared its winter, the causes she had fought for, the voices she had amplified, the rebellions she had embodied, they would endure beyond her. The anthology remained, her letters remained, her example remained. Others would pick up the fragments she left, others would continue the struggle. She was a leaf fallen, but the tree still stood. The rustling grows softer, the leaves scattering farther until the sound seems to dissolve into the quiet of the street. In that quiet, another sound emerges, distant and solemn, the hush of a door closing, its latch loose, unfastened, closing not with finality but with hesitation, as though it might yet be opened again. That door leads us into the next chamber of her life, where the solitude of exile deepens into poverty, addiction, and the haunting of madness, where Nancy becomes a shadow of herself and yet still refuses to disappear. The hush of the door closing lingers, not firm but hesitant, as though uncertain whether it means departure or return. It leaves behind a stillness heavy with absence, and into that stillness Nancy Cunard drifts further, deeper into the shadows of her final years. The war was over, but for her, peace did not arrive with victory. The world she had once inhabited, the salons of Paris, the cafes of Montparnasse, the barricades of Spain, the refugee camps, now seemed far away, half forgotten by those who had survived. For Nancy, survival itself had come at a cost. She was thinner, frailer, her body marked by hunger, her spirit worn by endless years of struggle. Poverty had become her companion, addiction her uneasy solace, madness her shadow. The rooms she occupied after the war were not the grand halls of her childhood, nor the vibrant spaces of her youth, but small, damp quarters where loneliness echoed more loudly than any laughter. She lived at times in near destitution, depending on friends or on the charity of strangers. Furniture was sparse, the air often heavy with the smell of smoke and unwashed clothes. The walls, once filled with manuscripts and letters, now bore little more than the silence of decline. Those who saw her during these years often described her as a ghost, a figure both haunting and haunted, recognizable, yet transformed into something more fragile, more spectral. Alcohol deepened its hold on her. Where once it had been a companion in cafes, shared over arguments and laughter, now it became a refuge from the weight of her own memories. She drank to blur the sharp edges of solitude, to silence the voices of doubt that pressed upon her in the night. But the drink, instead of consoling, often left her more vulnerable, her body further weakened, her mind more unstable. Madness whispered at the edges, in paranoia, in despair, in sudden outbursts of anger or sorrow. Those who remained loyal to her tried to help, but Nancy, always fierce in her independence, resisted both pity and intervention. She had lived her life on her own terms, and she would not surrender them even in ruin. Her writing during these years became erratic, fragmented, sometimes incoherent. She still attempted poems, still wrote letters, but often they bore the marks of disintegration. Sentences trailed off, thoughts fractured, ideas repeated in confusion. Yet within these fragments one can still glimpse her fire, sudden bursts of clarity, sharp condemnations of injustice, memories of lovers and comrades spoken with aching tenderness. The very brokenness of her writing mirrored the brokenness of her life, but it also carried truth. The truth that rebellion does not end neatly, that lives lived fiercely often end in fragments rather than resolutions. Society had largely forgotten her. The scandals that had once made her notorious were now old news, eclipsed by new celebrities, new wars, new distractions. Younger generations knew little of the heiress who had become a radical, the poet who had shocked London, the woman who had dared to love across race and class. To many, she was simply a figure of the past, an eccentric who had squandered her fortune and wasted her talent. But history is not written in the present moment, and Nancy herself seemed to understand that. She did not live for recognition. She lived because to stop living was unthinkable, because even in decline her spirit refused to extinguish. There were still brief moments of connection. Friends from earlier years, those who had not abandoned her, visited when they could. In their presence, the old Nancy sometimes flickered through, Sharp wit, sudden laughter, the sparkle of defiance in her eyes. But the moments never lasted. Fatigue always returned. The cough, the trembling hands, the fog of drink. The old brilliance was there, but it was like a candle in wind, visible only for a moment before it bent again toward darkness. Yet even in this decline there was a kind of grandeur, a dignity that came not from strength, but from refusal. Nancy would not be remade into a figure of repentance, would not apologize for her life, would not retreat into the safety of conformity. She remained scandalous even in poverty, unyielding even in madness. The bracelets, though fewer now, still clinked faintly when she moved, their sound like the echo of a lifetime of rebellion. They were reminders of the woman she had been, and the woman she still was, even as her body betrayed her. The door that had closed now remains unlatched, its latch loose, swinging slightly with each draft of air. It is not fully shut, not fully open, much like Nancy herself in these years, not fully present, not fully gone, suspended in a space between. Her life became a liminal existence, poised between memory and oblivion, between rebellion and surrender, between the fire she had once carried and the ashes that now surrounded her. One imagines her sitting in a narrow chair by that door, listening to its creak as it moves with the wind, imagining it as a threshold not yet crossed. Did she wonder who might walk through it? Did she hope for a friend, a lover, even a stranger to fill the silence? Or did she accept that no one would enter, that the door's movement was only the echo of her own solitude? The questions remain unanswered, like so much of her life. The door swings again, and this time the sound of its movement merges with another, the hush of footsteps walking away, soft at first, then fading into distance. These footsteps lead us to the final chapter of her life, to her last days in Paris, when she collapsed alone and was found not by friends or family but by strangers, when the heiress who had renounced inheritance became a destitute wanderer, her fate as scandalous as her life. The hush of footsteps drifts away, soft at first, then fading into the wide silence of streets where no one waits, no one calls. It is in such silences that Nancy Cunard passed her final days in Paris, the city that had once been alive with her laughter, her defiance, her bangles clattering against cafe tables. The Paris of her youth had been a stage of smoke and brilliance. The Paris of her end was a labyrinth of solitude, where she wandered as a ghost among strangers. She had once been surrounded by poets and painters, by lovers and rebels, by the noise of argument and song. Now she was alone, a thin figure dressed in rags, bracelets still faintly chiming, moving without recognition through streets that had forgotten her name. Her health, already frail, had collapsed further. Years of drink, of neglect, of hunger had left her body brittle, her skin drawn tight over bone. She was seen by some here and there, staggering, coughing, her steps uncertain. Passers-by rarely knew who she was. To them, she was another destitute woman, another figure lost to the city's indifference. Few realized that she had once been the daughter of fortune, the muse of modernists, the lover of jazz, the editor of a monumental anthology. History had slipped from her shoulders like a coat too heavy to bear, leaving her bare to the elements. It was in the spring of 1965 that she collapsed. Found by strangers in the street, her body crumpled on the pavement, she was carried not to a home, but to a hospital. She had no possessions, no family beside her, no fortune to cushion her fall. The heiress of Cunard ships, whose name had once glittered in society columns, was admitted as a pauper, a patient with no resources. Nurses tended her, doctors noted her decline, but there was no crowd at her bedside. No mother's hand, no lover's voice. The silence of those who might once have cared was louder than the bustle of the ward. Her body, wasted by years of struggle and solitude, could not recover. She lay in the hospital bed, her bracelets perhaps still faintly on her wrist, though now dulled, their sound barely audible. She was unconscious at times, restless at others, her mind wandering in fragments of memory. Perhaps she dreamed of Montparnasse nights, of Henry Crowder's piano, of Spain's battlefields, of the rustle of papers on her desk when she had compiled the Negro Anthology. Perhaps she heard again the clink of glasses in her mother's salons, or the toll of distant church bells, or the beat of a drum carried from Harlem. These sounds might have accompanied her as she drifted between waking and sleep, between life and death. On March 17, 1965, Nancy Cunard died. She was 69 years old. The end came not in grandeur, but in obscurity, her passing scarcely noted by the world she had once scandalized. A few obituaries appeared, some remembering her as a poet, others as a muse, many as a scandalous figure who had squandered her inheritance. Few captured the depth of her rebellion, the courage of her activism, the ferocity of her convictions. She was buried in a communal grave, her body laid to rest without ceremony, without the trappings of wealth that might have been hers had she chosen another path. And yet, there is a kind of symmetry in this ending. For Nancy had always rejected the comforts of privilege, had always chosen truth over convenience, had always preferred exile to conformity, to die in poverty, to be carried by strangers, to be buried without fanfare. This, too, was a form of defiance, an ending consistent with the life she had lived. She had walked away from inheritance, and she had walked away from recognition. And in the end, she walked into death as she had walked through life, uncompromising, scandalous, unyielding. But what are we to make of such an end? Was it triumph or tragedy? Did she destroy herself, or did she preserve something larger than herself by refusing every compromise? The questions linger without clear answer. Perhaps her life is not to be measured by success or failure, but by intensity. She lived fully, recklessly, with passion and conviction. She broke boundaries of class, of race, of gender, of art. She sacrificed comfort for truth, belonging for authenticity, recognition for justice. If the cost was loneliness and decline, it was a cost she had always been willing to pay. Her story does not conclude with neat closure. Like the unresolved piano chord of her love with Henry Crowder, like the scattered leaves of her exile, like the unlatched door of her solitude, her life ends in ambiguity. And perhaps that is fitting. For Nancy Cunard was never a figure of resolution. She was a question, a challenge, a disruption. Her very existence asked of the world, why must we obey its divisions, its prejudices, its silences? And the world, unable to answer, condemned her. The hush of footsteps that carried her into obscurity still lingers. They fade into silence, leaving behind only the faint hum of memory, the echo of bangles against bone, the whisper of papers turning in an empty room. From those sounds we move now into reflection, into the final chamber of her story, where we do not conclude but contemplate. The footsteps fade entirely, and in the distance another sound emerges, low and haunting, the horn of a ship far out at sea, carrying us into the ambiguity of her legacy. The footsteps fade into silence, and from that silence there emerges a low, resonant sound, distant yet unmistakable, the horn of a ship far out at sea. Its call is long and mournful, carrying across unseen waters, reminding us of voyages, of departures, of the heritage that Nancy Cunard was born into and spent her life resisting. It is a fitting sound with which to contemplate her legacy, for she herself was like a vessel unmoored, a ship that chose exile from harbor, sailing into seas no one expected her to cross. The horn does not announce arrival, but uncertainty, an echo that lingers long after its source has disappeared. What then remains of Nancy Cunard? Was she only the scandalous heiress who squandered her inheritance in bohemian experiments, or was she a woman who gave her life to truths larger than herself? To read her story only as tragedy is to see only the surface, the frail figure found in Paris, destitute and forgotten. To read her story only as rebellion is to ignore the loneliness, the exhaustion, the decline that marked her final years. Her life resists simplification. It is both and neither. It is a life that asked questions more than it gave answers, that insisted on living without compromise, no matter the cost. She was a poet, though often dismissed. Her verses, jagged and raw, were never meant to soothe. They were cries of authenticity, fragments of rebellion written in ink that sometimes faltered but never lied. She was a muse, though she resented the title, inspiring men who wrote her into their works even as she demanded her own voice be heard. She was a lover, crossing lines of race and class, living passion as though it were a form of resistance. She was an activist, pouring her fortune and her body into causes that outlived her. The fight against fascism, the struggle for racial justice, the demand that voices long silenced be finally heard. And yet she was also a woman broken by the very intensity of her living. Her loves often ended in sorrow, her friendships in estrangement, her activism in exhaustion. Her body collapsed under the strain of rebellion, her mind frayed under the weight of solitude. To honor her is not to deny these truths, but to recognize them as part of the whole. For rebellion is not a straight path to triumph. It is a jagged road of sacrifice, of mistakes, of losses endured for the sake of refusing silence. Was she destroyed by her rebellion or preserved by it? This question remains unresolved, like the unfinished chords that haunted her life. Had she chosen comfort, she might have lived longer, easier, more gently. But she would not have been Nancy Cunard. She would not have left us the anthology that still speaks, the letters that still burn, the example of a life lived against the grain. She preserved something essential, not only in herself, but in history, by refusing to submit, by insisting on the scandal of truth. If the cost was loneliness, perhaps it was the price required to leave a voice that could not be silenced. The ship horn sounds again, deeper now, fading into the mist of distance. We are left with its echo, as we are left with Nancy's echo, fragments of verse, photographs of her slim figure draped in bangles, stories of her defiance told and retold. She does not rest neatly in memory. She unsettles us, as she unsettled her contemporaries, asking whether we too are willing to give up comfort for truth, inheritance for justice, belonging for authenticity. Her life is less a lesson than a question posed to all who hear it, and so we end not with closure, but with ambiguity. Nancy Cunard remains a figure unresolved, her story unfinished, her presence both tragic and triumphant. She lived as a scandal, but perhaps scandal itself was her gift, her way of forcing the world to confront what it preferred to ignore. She died in obscurity, but her words and actions continue to ripple outward, like waves from a ship long vanished into the horizon. The horn of the ship fades finally into silence, leaving us with the vast sound of the sea itself, endless, unresolving, eternal. It is the sea upon which the Cunard fortune was built, the sea Nancy rejected, the sea that carried her in spirit through exile and rebellion. It is the sea that holds her still, not in resolution but in movement, in question, in ambiguity. And so we leave her there, not concluded but remembered, an echo, a question, a rebellion without end.